Thank you for all those lies, Mike. Okay, guys, so there's are folks hearing me? Yeah. Okay, guys, so there's a handout because with most philosophy lectures, my experience has been that people fall asleep about halfway through, or for the really interesting ones, maybe 3/4 of the way through. So it's always good to wake up at the end with something in your hand so you know what the guy actually said. So in that spirit, I have a whole set of handouts. I hope there'll be enough. So maybe if we could have some assistance in distributing them so people get their copies straight away. Not that you should either A, fall asleep or B, leave at this point, but just so you can sort of follow. Okay, so the topic is liberalism and racial justice, and sort of in a tradition of trying to make things clear, which is a philosophical tradition. I'm going to start off with race, and then liberalism, and then justice. So if you have a handout, what I hope should be a sort of useful diagram on the front, different perspectives on the reality of race. So you can sort of see race from different perspectives. Some people think that race doesn't exist in any sense at all. They have a position that you could say you need to sort of eliminate race from our language and our vocabulary because race doesn't exist. Then other people think no, race does exist. And then there's a split within a camp of those who think race does exist on the nature of that existence. Is it the case that race exists in a natural biological way, or is it the case that race exists as a socio-political construct? So sort of, get your head onto what I'm sort of saying here. Think of it this way. Let's suppose that this auditorium were transferred back in time, let's say to 1,000 years ago, sometime in medieval Europe. So if you believe in race as a biological entity, it would then follow that everybody in this room would have the same race then as they have now. Whereas people who see race as a social construct would argue that what really would happen is that everybody in this room would cease to have a race. It's not that everybody would become the same color, it's not that everybody would become to have the same hair texture and facial features, but that the social category of race would not be one in that time period. So in that sense, race would cease to exist. So most people who work on race in philosophy, as I do, basically subscribe to that second position. They see race not as something that's biologically real, but that's something that's a social construct. So it is real, but it's real in a different sense. It's something that's real, that's relevant to particular societies at particular time periods. So one of the implications of that is that it means that if you move from one society with a particular set of racial rules to another, your race could change. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's because we're thinking of race as biological. If you think of race as a social construct, it would then make sense that if the particular rules of the society you're in categorize you differently from a racial point of view, then your race could change across national borders. And in fact, even in a given society, if it's the case that the racial rules in that particular society change, you could stay in one society and your race could change. Again, because you're now categorized differently, let's say 50 years after you were born than at the time you were born. So the important thing to try to get clear on is the sort of simultaneity of the reality of race and the fact that this reality is not a socially transcendent reality, but it's a reality that is basically linked to the particular social system in which you are. So it's completely real in the sense of privileging you or disadvantaging you, sort of in a shaping your consciousness, the way you sort of think of the world, your identity, the kind of people you hang out with, your social circles, the people you date, the people you marry. Completely real in all those senses, but the reality is system relative rather than biological. So the crucial question then becomes, in the particular country in which you're in, what are the racial rules of that country? And of course, we're here in the US, the crucial question will be, what are the racial rules of the American racial system? Does everybody now have their handouts? Or I should ask it the other way, does anybody not have a handout? Bunch of folks at the back, you guys have your handouts? Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, so nice, neat diagram, metaphysics of race, race as non-existent, race as existent, race as biological existence, race as socio-political existent, and the position I'll be taking is race as existent, but existent in a socio-political way. Okay, so that's race. Let's move on now to liberalism. Now, in the US context, liberalism usually means liberalism on the left. So, for example, you'd say the Democratic Party historically has tended to sort of left liberal side of the spectrum, and we call them, Democrats liberals, and then on the other hand, you have conservatives on the Republican Party. So it's important to understand from the start, I'm not using liberalism in that limited sense. I'm using liberalism in the broad sense that includes both sides of the political spectrum. So by liberalism, I'm referring to the political philosophy that emerged in Western Europe in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and emerges in response to the social system inherited from the previous feudal order. So liberalism in this sense is a sort of political spectrum that includes liberalism on the left and liberalism on the right. And the sort of defining characteristic is the idea that we should see people not as members of social estates, as they were in the medieval period. So, for example, you're a humble serf, you're a humble peasant. On the other hand, you're a lord and a lady. Not in that sense. We should see people as individuals. And we should see people as morally equal. And that's something we now take for granted, of course. But in the historic time period you were talking about, this was a very radical view. So the people we now think of maybe as sort of boring and instead of saying obvious stuff, in their time they were saying radical stuff. In fact, John Locke, sort of crucial figure in the development of liberal political philosophy, Locke did not sign his name to the 2 treatises of government in his lifetime because he figured this is kind of dangerous stuff. I'll just keep it secret. It's only because in his will he had a little phrase that acknowledged authorship that people knew for sure he was the author. So these ideas that we now take for granted were once very radical ideas. Because the idea was what you had was a hierarchy and some people were better than others. So, lords and ladies, they're definitely on a different social level than humble peasants. And to say that, they're equal, that would just be as a crazy and very radical idea. So the basic principles of liberalism that we now take for granted were once very radical ideas indeed. Okay, so if you think of the slogans of the French Revolution or the famous opening lines of Thomas and Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. These are basically the sort of hallmarks, the watchwords of liberalism as a political philosophy. See people as individuals, see people as morally equal, and the question then becomes, what kind of society, what kind of government is appropriate for people who are moral equals, who are no longer in the feudal system, the system where you have a system that it's the lords and ladies ruling over everything, but a system where everybody is morally equal. And of course, we now take for granted that the appropriate government would be a democratic government, and that the role of the government is to safeguard our rights. So in this broad sense, even people we now consider conservatives would count as liberals. So they're liberals on the right and liberals on the left, and they're supposed to be agreed on the moral equality of individuals, and what divides them is different positions on the role of the state as against the role of the market in the economy and in the function of the government. Do you want to sort of leave everything up to the market, so people compete on the market and their fates are then determined by that? Or do you want a government that's going to intervene, that's going to sort of help those at the bottom and so forth? And these issues are still very much with us today, and we're going to see them, of course, in the debates on the campaign trail. On the one hand, the various Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders, sort of further to the left, and Hillary Clinton, and the various Republican candidates. So these ideas are by no means dead and settled. They continue to be alive, but what is not supposed to be controversial is the basic claim of the moral equality of all individuals. So that's a sort of foundation of liberalism, and then you can fight over other things, as I say, market versus government intervention, but that is not supposed to be controversial. Okay, so that's liberalism, that's race, and let's now turn to the question of how do people's identities fit within liberal political philosophy? So if people are just individuals, then what about social identities like race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth? And there are 2 main answers to this question. I mean, there's always a range of answers on stuff. So, you could say they're more complicated variants. But the 2 main answers I'm going to single out are the following. One answer is that our social identities should be irrelevant. we're just individuals as persons, and so issues of gender, issues of race, issues of sexual orientation should be relevant. Liberalism as a philosophy should be colorblind. Liberalism should be gender blind, and as such, once you start taking account of these identities, you're getting into discrimination in a pejorative sense. So for these people who sort of take this particular perspective on liberalism, you want a liberalism that's blind to social identities. All that matters is that, each individual is a person. That's what we should be focusing on. But there's another position which says, no disagreement with you on the moral equality of people, but there's no contradiction between recognizing people's moral equality and the different historic role that these identities have played in determining the fates of people. Because the problem with liberalism as an ideology, as a political philosophy, is that it's basically been honored more in the breach than in the observance. In the sense that these liberal principles and ideals are very admirable, very attractive, but political states calling themselves liberal have not generally lived up to them. And I don't have to tell you that in the United States, women, for example, who you'd think these are human beings, these are moral equals, they should have equal rights. Women don't get the vote until 1920. In the case of blacks, after the period of Reconstruction, after the Civil War, you have a brief period where blacks do get to vote, and then with the betrayal of Reconstruction, with withdrawal of federal troops, you then have widespread black disenfranchisement. So it's only really in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, that black Americans get to vote across the country. So just think of that. Think of the age of the US, sort of 1776 founding, and apart from this brief period after the Civil War, black Americans do not get the vote until the 1960s, and women, as I say, 1920. So in practice, what it means is that governments calling themselves liberal have in fact been non-liberal in crucial respects in excluding large sections of the population from the promise of liberal equality. So people who take the second perspective argue that you need to recognize this history when you're talking about how liberalism should see these individuals, and once you're talking about the question of the historical injustices done to particular groups. So that moral individualism, sort of foundation stone of liberalism, recognizing everybody as a moral equal, we should not think that from moral individualism it follows that we should see people as lifted out of society, as lifted out of history. Rather, we should see them in historical context. We should recognize the histories that have shaped their fates differently. So from the second point of view, there's no inconsistency in liberalism recognizing social identities, and in fact, this recognition is crucial to achieving liberal social justice. And you won't be surprised to hear that of those two positions, I favor the second one. So I don't think that color blindness and gender blindness is the appropriate way to go. Rather, I think you want gender sensitivity, color sensitivity, and so forth, to recognize the fact that different people's histories have positioned them differently in society and have sort of shaped their fates in such a way that some groups have been oppressed, and we need to recognize that oppression once we start talking about liberal social justice. Justice, section 3. So a quick and snappy way of thinking of justice is who should get what and why. And there's a famous contrast with the definition many people have given of politics. Could somebody give me the definition of politics? Okay, politics is who does get what and why. So it's obviously somewhat different. There's a moral ideal of who should get what, and there's a reality of politics who does get what, and that's not usually determined, alas, by morality. That's determined by things like political power, that's determined by organization, that's determined by sort of the extent to which people can get together to develop a movement to forward their interests. So the world of justice and the world of politics are often very different, and if you're an idealistic person, you want to sort of bring them together. You want it to be the case that politics is determined by morality, is determined by justice, but alas, as I say, there's often a big difference. Okay, so justice, one of the central themes of philosophy, and in fact, the book that many people see as the sort of fountainhead of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato's Republic, that's a central theme of the book. It's not quite justice in our contemporary sense, but at least, that's the sort of sense we're using. So racial justice is our theme for this evening's talk. Where does racial justice fit? We'll have, put together a sort of simple chart which sort of gives you a sense of the possibilities. So we could ask the question for justice, what is the value foundation which it is being based? For example, is it utilitarian? Is it Kantian? Is it Rawlsian? Then the question of which subgroup are we looking at for the question of justice? Is it gender? Is it class? Is it race? Is it same sex? For people who are sympathetic to animal rights, are we looking at non-human animal and the question of justice for them? Social sector, is it justice in a particular area of society, like the educational sector, the criminal justice system? Is it more global, sort of issues of climate justice? And then finally, crucial question, are we assuming ideal theory circumstances or non-ideal theory circumstances? Okay, so quick overview of justice. So racial justice would then be justice for a particular subgroup, groups of races, bearing in mind the critique of women of color in recent years, that you can't sort of separate race from gender because they're intersectional issues. So we need to sort of bear that in mind. So, crucial question then, why worry about demarcating racial justice? Why don't we just talk about justice in general? In other words, why balkanize the subject of justice? Why don't we have justice for everybody? And people will have followed the controversy about Black Lives Matter. And the response of some people, what do you mean Black Lives Matter? Shouldn't we be saying everybody's lives matter? And you could imagine people asking a similar question about racial justice. Why are you guys so focused on racial justice? Why don't we talk about justice for everybody? And the answer is that, of course, ideally, we would have a concept of justice that sort of encompasses justice for everyone. But the problem is in philosophy, and not just in philosophy, but the real world as well, it's often the case that abstractions have been put forward which seem to encompass everybody, but do not in fact do so. And to return to that quote of Jefferson, Jefferson exemplifies it very well, because we have this famous declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, and this is being put forward by a slave owner. So all people are created equal, at the same time, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. So we have the United States being founded on a very attractive set of ideals, so the principles of liberalism and inclusion, and simultaneously the problems of Native American expropriation, there's African slavery, and the legacy of those problems is still with us today. So if you want to know why we should talk about racial justice, the answer is that if the supposedly generic, all-encompassing justice had in fact included racial justice, then we wouldn't need to be talking about it. But since in fact it didn't, we do. So we need to sort of say, here are the peculiar features of racial justice. We need to sort of get this as part of the national conversation. Philosophy in particular, I would say there are two main reasons why racial justice has not been addressed as a subject. One answer is, given what I just said at the start, the recency of race as a historical identity. And that's different from gender, that's different from class. So class as an identity obviously goes back as long as there have been class societies. Gender goes back even further because, basically from the origin of the species, you have these two sexes and we don't have historical records from that period, obviously, but the presumption would be that human beings have always had some set of gender norms in the society they've been in, and usually these gender norms have disadvantaged women. So gender as an identity, gender as a social structure, gender injustice, that's very old. Whereas if race, as I've said, is comparatively recent, it would then follow that racial injustice is likewise something very recent, very as against gender. So you could say, well, philosophers can be excused for not talking about race because it doesn't have the sort of antiquity of gender. I'm going to suggest that even if this analysis is correct, then the conclusion doesn't follow. And here are 4 reasons. If racial injustice is distinctive to modernity, then for that very reason it would be of interest, because there's been a huge body of literature basically trying to articulate, we're going to the dark again. Now, I know I wrote a book called Blackness Visible, but it doesn't, okay, thank God for that. I didn't want to sort of demonstrate in practice. Okay, so there's a lot of literature on the difference between the pre-modern period and the modern period. So even if it's the case that race is a distinctively modern creation, that should make it an item of interest for that very reason. Second, racial injustice, has involved great atrocities. I think of slavery, think of genocide, at precisely the time when the equality of human beings was being broadly declared. So the contradiction was very sharp in that respect. And then on a global scale, if you see the modern world as being created by European imperialism, by European colonialism, if you see racism as central to that process, it then follows that racial injustice has historically affected the fate of the majority of the population of the world. So these are all reasons why, even if race is recent as a social category and a social reality, it's nonetheless the case that racial justice should be seen by us as a very important topic. So the obvious question then, why hasn't philosophy? And philosophers was with the justice guys. I mean, you have people in the civil rights community doing justice, you have people in ethnic studies doing justice, but philosophers are supposed to be sort of justice league of the planet guys. In the sense that, as I say, in the Western tradition, foundational book, justice is its theme. So why have philosophers not had more to say about racial justice? I think the answer is linked with the demography, and that the demography has sort of helped to bring into existence a certain conceptual topography, a certain kind of map of the world that's sort of shaped by race. By the demography, I mean that though people of color are underrepresented in the humanities in general, in philosophy it's extreme. It's one of the very whitest of the humanities. So that when you go into an American Philosophical Association meeting, you basically have to sort of put on dark glasses. There's a separate pair of dark glasses I have for that. Because there's this sort of blinding sea of whiteness, and you could basically lose your sight from that. So you need dark glasses to go to the APA. And to give you a sense of the numbers, there are like more than 11,000 professional philosophers. There are about 130 black philosophers in the entire country. So it means that right now, on my narrow shoulders, the responsibility rests of keeping alive that 1%. So that when I get on the plane, sort of fly back to Chicago, I have to make sure that nothing happens, because if I'm gone, that's 1% of black American philosophers there, gone on the spot. So if you have a very white profession, then the likelihood is, it's not a matter of logic, because clearly there's no logical connection, because white philosophers can work on race as well. But the likelihood is that this is not a subject going to be taken up by a larger white profession. And you can sort of see the precedent in terms of gender, because you have philosophy in the Western tradition existing for over 2,000 years, and women, of course, being half the population over that same period, and also women being subordinated over that same period. And yet you cannot find a sort of crucial body of work by male Western philosophers talking about gender injustice. The exception is John Stuart Mill, and even from a contemporary feminist point of view, there are problems with what Mill says. So if the maleness of philosophy has produced an indifference to gender justice, so that it's only when women begin to enter the profession, significant numbers in the 1970s that get a concern with this, we should not be surprised that similarly there's been a lack of concern about racial justice, considering that the whiteness of the profession is even more extreme than its maleness. In the case of women, figures are not sort of various. Some people say 16%, some people say 20%. In the case of race, it's about 2% people of color. Very white profession. So given that, it's not surprising that race has not been a subject taken up by philosophy. So the demographic whiteness is uncontroversial. You can see it proven at any APA meeting. The conceptual whiteness might seem to be a bit harder to put your finger on, insofar as philosophy's pretensions are to be dealing with the human condition as such. And you could get the argument, well, look, we're talking about humans in general. People of color are human. Therefore, what do you mean? Obviously, the experience of people of color is subsumable under these abstractions. These abstractions include everybody. And the problem with that argument is that you can get concepts which are seemingly abstract, seemingly inclusive, but in fact, if you look at their structure, they're structured in such a way that particular experiences are excluded. And feminists have done a lot of work critiquing seemingly abstract male claims and have revealed the gender structuring of these concepts. In the case of race, we make a similar argument in that the narratives of philosophy, the assumptions, the frameworks, the thought experiments. If there are any philosophy majors here, you know about philosophy thought experiments. They're basically predicated on the European and the Euro-American experience. They're not talking about a history of expropriation, history of genocide, history of slavery, history of Jim Crow segregation. These are not usually part of the sort of historical makeup of these abstractions. So the abstractions pretend to be universal and all-inclusive, but if you sort of check out what they're founded on, it's really the European and Euro-American experience. And this manifests itself in the thing we started talking about at the start, liberalism as a political philosophy and the historical narratives of its origin, of its development. And the unfortunate truth is that the actual history of liberalism has been sanitized and obfuscated, and that the ideology of individualism, egalitarianism, and equal rights was far more often complicit with racism and white supremacy than it was in opposition to them. John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, George Hegel, all these big names, they all had racist views. And these racist views arguably influenced the way their liberal principles applied across the color line. So you think of things like the Lockean notion of self-ownership, if you think of civilization, if you think of the Kantian idea of autonomy and personhood, if you think of John Stuart Mill and culture, Hegel and contributions to world history, all these crucial concepts of these liberal theorists were all influenced by race. So liberalism in its hegemonic varieties was racialized. Now today's liberalism, you could say, is purged of such exclusions. But the problem is, if you just sort of assume that the population of people of color can be assimilated to the white population using the same set of concepts without taking account of how they've been shaped by racism, then you're going to get a situation where the distinctive experience of people of color continues to be marginalized. So I suggest that we see liberalism as racial in sort of two main forms. There's the overtly racist form, where you have negative comments being made about people of color, Native Americans as savages and so forth. And there's a contemporary version of liberal theory where you will not find such negative comments being made, but nonetheless, the apparatus is still racial in the sense that it's conceptually shaped historically and it's ethically oriented by the population who were basically sort of main practitioners and developers. So it's going to be shaped by a kind of whiteness. It's a liberalism which claims to be generic and all-inclusive. It's going to be a liberalism that's racialized as white. And the failure to deal with racial justice in liberal political philosophy, I would claim, is a central and obvious manifestation of the whiteness I'm talking about. And I'm basically suggesting what I think should be fairly obvious once you think about it. Had there been more people of color actively involved in the shaping of this ideology, racial justice as a theme would have been upfront and central. So the very fact that racial justice has not been central, that's prima facie evidence of the racialized nature of liberal political theory. And that brings us to John Rawls. How many people here have heard the name John Rawls? Oh, quite a bunch. Okay, good. So John Rawls, the most famous 20th century liberal political theorist. Not merely the most famous in the United States, but his fans would say the most famous and influential in the world. And Rawls is given the credit for reviving Anglo-American political philosophy. I put it in that form because sometimes Anglo-American political philosophers think of themselves as the world. So we are the world, our political philosophy, everybody. And in fact, there are lots of political traditions outside this. There's a left tradition, there's a Marxist tradition, there are third world traditions in different nations. But there's a sense, we are the real thing. We're the sort of main deal, and our philosophy is the political philosophy. So from this perspective, Anglo-American political philosophy in the 1950s was seen as on its deathbed. So the articles were so boring. It's not merely the case that the people reading them tended to fall asleep, but the authors, as they wrote them, tended to nod off. What was I saying again? Oh, yes, right. How should sovereignty should be analyzed? So boring stuff like that. And if you sort of go back to sort of textbooks from the period, you'll find people talking about the idea that political philosophy is on its deathbed. Nobody's doing exciting stuff anymore. And John Rawls is seen as doing a kind of Lazarus act. He brings political philosophy back to life, arise and walk again. And this crucial book here is a 1971 book, A Theory of Justice. And the idea is that Rawls says we're going to revive political philosophy, and I'm going to do it through the vehicle of the social contract. So the social contract tradition, which have been very influential about 1650 to 1800, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, going to revive the social contract tradition, but in the form of a thought experiment. And the way it works is that Rawls said, imagine you're choosing principles of social justice from behind a veil of ignorance. So you don't know whether you're male or female, whether you're black or white, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're smart or average. You're going to choose principles of justice in such a way that personal bias will not enter the situation. You can't choose a racist society because you don't know whether you're going to be the race privileged by that society. You can't choose a sexist society for the same reason. So you're going to choose a society whose principles, in theory, are going to work for everybody. And Rawls resurrects political philosophy. And you now have this huge body of literature, not by any means that everybody's a Rawlsian, but even where people are sort of hostile to Rawls, he constitutes the central reference point. So you sort of, you're either in the Rawls camp or you're anti-Rawls, but in either case, Rawls is the central figure. So Rawls deserves credit for this resurrection of political philosophy. So that's the upside of Rawls. So here's the downside. The downside is that Rawls basically works within a traditional liberal framework where the key function is these issues of to what extent should the market or the government be sort of playing a crucial role in the economy. So it's basically a white male class framework, whether you're on the political left or the political right. The distinctive problems of women and gender injustice are not addressed. The distinctive problems of people of color and racial injustice are not addressed. And in addition, Rawls focuses his work, if you go back to the table I had at the start, on what he called ideal theory. It's important to appreciate that ideal theory is not just moral theory, because obviously you need morality to do justice theory by definition. By ideal theory, Rawls means the theory of justice for a perfectly just society. And once you do that, the problem is that issues of race are then automatically sidelined. Because if race is a social construct, if it's a social construct brought into existence by discriminatory practices, such as Native American expropriation and African slavery and white colonial rule, in a perfectly just society, it means that not only would no race have been the victim of injustice, but arguably races would not even exist. If race is a product of discriminatory processes, if in the society there have been no macro-level discriminatory processes, races would not exist. Which is great as an ideal, but the problem is we're not there, we're here, and we want to know what do we do in our society where races do exist. So just think about this for a moment. This is the most important American political philosopher of the 20th century. This is a guy who revives political philosophy. He's an American citizen. He's a citizen of a country which has been deeply shaped by racial injustice from its very inception. Native American expropriation and genocide, African slavery, postbellum Jim Crow. And John Rawls has nothing useful to say about race. So he has 5 authored books in his lifetime, sort of add up total about 2,000 pages. If you put together every sentence on race in those 5 books, you might get 5 or 6 pages. Affirmative action for many people is the most important post-war public policy measure to deal with the legacy of racial injustice. The phrase affirmative action can be found nowhere in the 2,000 pages of Rawls's 5 books. And it's not just Rawls, it's the secondary literature. It's the people who are his disciples and apostles and commentators and even his critics. And a manifestation of this is that there's a huge Blackwell companion to Rawls. Came out last year. It's nearly 600 pages. And in this book, and I counted to make sure, there's a grand total of 1.5 pages on race. And if you look up affirmative action in the index, you are directed towards a single sentence. So in nearly 600 pages, there's a single sentence on affirmative action. So if you go back to my claims about the whiteness of philosophy, not merely demographically, but conceptually, I would claim here is an obvious candidate. A book on justice in the United States, whose history is a long history of racial injustice, and this book merrily and calmly ignores the question of race and racial injustice and the measures that have been attempted to sort of end racial injustice. So the problem is that political philosophy, which is the very subject that deals with justice, has basically been missing in action. And that people of color interested in these issues have not been able to find any guidance from political philosophy because basically it's not talking about race. So the question then is, how do we redress this situation? And this is part of what I've been trying to do in my work, and there are other people, of course, trying to do it with me. And it's not the case that they're all people of color. There's some white progressives as well also working in the field. Okay, here's my claim. I hope you won't find it too radical or threatening. In mainstream political philosophy, when people talk about race, the focus is on racism, as ideas, as values, as beliefs, and so forth. My preferred framework is white supremacy. Now, here's the downside of this terminology. This is 2015. Why is this guy using this language? It sounds polemical, it sounds extremist, it sounds outdated. White supremacy during the time of slavery, sure. White supremacy during the time of Jim Crow, sure. But for God's sake, there's a black guy in the White House. So how can we be talking about white supremacy now? So here's my response. If white supremacy as a phrase sounds too polemical, then substitute structural white domination. And ask yourself the following very simple question: has the election of President Obama ended structural white domination in the United States? And if you think about it, I think you'll agree with me that the answer is no. So white supremacy, I suggest we think of it in the following way. White domination leading to systemic, significant, unfair white advantage established by white causality, actions and inactions, and maintained in place by white causality, actions and inactions. So let's go through each of these. Systemic, so it's more than individual transactions. I'm talking about it as a social system rather than individual racist acts. Significant, more than minor differences. So where quantification is possible, think of discrepancies in wealth, in employment, incarceration rates, and life expectancies. We're getting major differences here. Unfair. If whites really did work harder, you could say, well, it's completely fair that whites should have more money. What are you talking about? But it's not because of that. It's because of morally wrong social practices. White advantage, it's a system that privileges whites. Established by and maintained by, it didn't just happen, it was brought into existence by white causality, people actually doing stuff, or people failing to do stuff. That's the point of mentioning inactions as well as actions, failing to do stuff when action should have been called for. For example, failing to dismantle Jim Crow during the 1960s in response to the civil rights movement, when you had this active black movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. basically saying this system is unfair. Now here's an accusation you sometimes get. You're a conspiracy theorist as a conspiracy theory. Because for a lot of people, you have a kind of false dichotomy. Either things just happen or it's a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are false, therefore things just happen. Two problems with that. Number one, there are real-life conspiracies. Those of you who have been following, the big scandal with Volkswagen, sort of know this is exactly what these guys did. They sort of, they did not think that they could meet the environmental standards, so they basically sort of organized things, sort of make sure that it did not come to light, that the cars were, flawed in this crucial way. There are corporate conspiracies all the time. The tobacco industry is one obvious example, where information about sort of negative effects of smoking was sort of hidden and obfuscated for years. So conspiracies take place all the time. So that's point number one. But the second point is there's no conspiracy in this case because coordinated human causality alone does not mean a conspiracy. A conspiracy requires secrecy. By definition, a conspiracy is something done in the dark. You have conspiracies among the Klan, you have conspiracies among white citizens' council in the 1950s, but most of the stuff on race is being done in the open. Slavery, it's not the case that you can conceal slavery. There are all these folks, in the cotton fields. I mean, are you going to hide them behind, the Great House or something? No. Segregation, that's public. There are white and colored signs everywhere. You're talking about, decisions made by Congress, talking about Supreme Court rulings, talking about, edicts from the White House. This stuff is all public. So there's no conspiracy for the most part because it's being done in the open. So it's important to appreciate that white supremacy did not just happen. It's a result of coordinated white causality, and that's not a conspiracy because coordinated human causality is what has brought us to where we are. We're in this building with the lights on. I hope I can say that safely. And we have this great room you guys have. All of these things are brought into existence by human beings coordinating and working together. And that's not just for physical objects and buildings. That's also for social institutions. White supremacy was an institution brought into existence by the coordinated actions, largely of white human beings. So if you turn the page now, then I'm suggesting that you see white supremacy as multidimensional. And these, in my opinion, are the sort of 6 crucial dimensions. There's a legal and political aspect. There's the economic aspect. There's a way it affects social cognition. There's a cultural aspect. There's a somatic aspect, because part of white supremacy is basically sort of privileging of the white body, becomes the body beautiful. And there's the ontological aspect from a philosophical point of view. This is the idea that in racism, you're basically saying that some people are equal beings and other humans are unequal beings. So there's a sense in which the very foundation of racism is to say that some beings are lesser. Even if they seem human, they're inferior humans, or in the most extreme kinds of racism, they're not human at all. So the virtue of this approach is that it's structural. And one of the things that John Rawls says is that we should see social justice as dealing with basic structure. And I'm saying that in the case of racism, the basic structure is a white supremacist one. You could imagine other societies where there are different kinds of racist structure, but in our society, that's what we have to deal with, a white supremacist basic structure. So the crucial question then becomes, how do you dismantle white supremacy? And my claim is that you can use a modified form of Rawls's apparatus. And there are many people who find this very controversial because they're completely on board with my criticism of Rawls, my criticism of liberalism, and they're then disappointed because they say, after saying all that, how can you then go back to liberalism? How can you go back to Rawls? Shouldn't we be trying to come up with something entirely new? And my argument in response is that the basic principles of liberalism are very attractive. Moral equality, equality before the law, a government that safeguards all its citizens' interests. There's nothing wrong with this as an idea. The problem is not with liberalism. The problem is with a liberalism that historically has been patriarchal, that has historically been racist. So if you have a racial liberal theory, we want to deracialize it. So that's basically my project, to deracialize a liberalism that has historically been racialized. So in the case of Rawls, okay, I've been going on too long, so I'm going to try and wrap this up, guys. So in the case of Rawls, my claim is that we'd modify Rawls in the following way. Rawls's focus, as I said, is a perfectly just society. So you go behind the veil, so you don't know crucial things about yourself, you choose principles of justice for a perfectly just society. That's all very well as an enterprise, but it doesn't address the question of race. So here's my modification of Rawls. You go behind the veil and you choose, but you're no longer choosing for a perfectly just society. You're choosing for a society which basically has as its ancestor white supremacy. And the question then is, you have different possible variants sort of spreading out from that root, and that's going to be determined by the principles of corrective justice you choose. So imagine the following sort of scenario. The veil, Rawls calls it the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance lifts, and you're a black woman on the south side of Chicago. The veil of ignorance lifts, and you're a Latino in the southwestern United States. The veil of ignorance lifts, and you're a Native American on the reservation. In other words, in technical philosophical language, you're screwed. So the question then is, given this situation, what measures of public policy would you want to see put in place to make sure that as far as possible, you did not suffer from the racist society you now discover you're in, that you're disadvantaged by? So it then means that your attention is focused on principles of corrective justice that you want to see the state put into operation to correct for the situation of white racial domination and the disadvantage you experience as a person of color in this. And my argument would be that you look at things like the economy, the structure of opportunities, the legal and political system, the dominant norms and cultural patterns, and you basically would argue for principles of corrective justice. And I've put them here in bold, nice and bold, so you can sort of see the sort of three key areas I think are important. Number one, citizenship that is not equal, it's second class. And historically, in sort of discussing the situation of blacks, there's a standard phrase, they're not equal citizens, they're second class citizens, and this experience sort of expresses one crucial dimension of racial injustice. You're not an equal citizen. So end the status of being a second class citizen. Number two, economic disadvantage. So slavery, it's pretty obvious, you're disadvantaged by being a slave, but even after emancipation, it's not the case that you ever get reparations, you never get the 40 acres and a mule, so you then have to sort of compete on the market with people who have advantages over you, and it's not even the case that then you're being treated equally, there continues to be discrimination. So long history of discrimination against blacks, later against Latinos, and this manifests itself in huge differences in wealth between white and black and Latino households. So principle number two, end racial exploitation and economic marginalization. And finally, number three, and I spoke about the ontological sort of crucial philosophical concept, we're talking about what kind of being you are. And racism basically says that some people, some human beings are not equal beings. So this is more kind of amorphous, but I'm saying that racial disrespect to diss people because of their race, that's crucial to a racist social system. So the ending of racial disrespect is a third crucial principle of racial justice. So my claim would be that if you use this framework, this modified Rawlsian framework, you can then come up with these principles of justice so that you're sort of doing something that's liberal, you're working within the political philosophy that historically most Americans have endorsed, and you're basically saying to your fellow American citizens, if you're a good liberal, you should support these principles. Problem. If the world was motivated by morality, it would not be in the shape it is now. So we're humans, we're fallible humans, we're selfish humans, we act morally some of the time, a lot of the time we don't. So the question then is, to what extent can moral argumentation, moral suasion actually bring change, especially when people have a vested interest in the existing order? So if whites benefit from white supremacy, how do you motivate the white majority by morality when they have a vested group interest in the situation staying the same? My argument is that maybe moral argumentation is not going to be enough, and that you're going to have to appeal to prudential motivation, in other words, people's self-interest. And this might seem kind of weird, because how could you appeal to people's self-interest when you've just said that whites benefit from the social system? I suggest that there are two possible strategies to appeal to self-interest. There's a centrist strategy, and a centrist strategy goes like this. Think of all the talented people of color that are being excluded by a racist system. Think of the costs of the prison industry, the prison industrial complex, as it has been called. All those people are currently marginalized by the system. In a non-racist economy, we could sort of bring them into the system, and we could benefit from their talents. And it means that the GNP could increase, and the entire society would be better off. So the kind of centrist strategy by virtue of which you're appealing to the white population as a whole. Everybody would be better off in a non-racist United States. Does that seem plausible? Is that going to sort of pull people? Maybe, maybe not. So there's a left strategy which you might think, well, this one has a better chance of working. The left strategy tries to disaggregate the white population, and it targets its appeal to working class whites, to poor whites, to people who are basically handicapped by the system as well, even if they're doing better than their equivalents in the black and Latino population. And you basically say to them, why is it that the richest country in the Western world, that would be the United States, has the most inequitable income and wealth distribution in the Western world? Why is it the case that there's no national health care program, which every other Western nation has? So in Obamacare, as you know, it's obviously a step in the right direction, but it's not really national. Why is it that the United States is so different from other Western industrialized nations? And an answer that historically many black intellectuals have given, it's because of race. Because what has happened is that the white working class, who historically would be the people negatively affected by the sort of more extreme forms of capitalism, who would try to form trade unions, who try to form a social democratic party, as you have in Canada, as you have in Western Europe. The white working class has let their racial identity, that is whiteness, trump their class identity. So that blacks have been kept out of unions, blacks have been kept out of segregated neighborhoods, that white workers would even used to have hate strikes, sort of keep blacks out of industries and factories. So that you've had a situation where the white working class has basically let whiteness be their major identity. And in a short-term way, this has succeeded, but we're now in an age where it's no longer the case that the United States is the most dominant post-war economic power. So an increasing number of theorists say we're now in the new Gilded Age. That's a reference to a famous book co-authored by Mark Twain and some other guy whose name I don't recall. He's writing about the 1870s or so, the period of extremes of wealth and poverty. So that was the first Gilded Age, and the second Gilded Age is the Roaring 20s, 1920s, where again, there are these sort of extremes of wealth and poverty, and then of course with the Great Depression, everything comes crashing down. So some of you may have read, or at least have read the book reviews of, as I did, it was time to read the actual book, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, and he's basically saying in crucial respects, it's not that he's a Marxist, but he's saying in crucial respects, Marx had it right. There are these trends in capitalism, these extremities of wealth and poverty, concentrated wealth at the upper echelons. And Piketty predicts that's where we're headed. So the point is that even the white working class are going to be disadvantaged by this. That insofar as you're worried about the fates of your children, fates of your grandchildren, it means that you can then appeal to the group interests of whites in this class and say, hey guys, this system is not going to be working too well for you either. Pensions are drying up. The kids are moving, well, in your case, you guys are the kids who will be moving back home, possibly. But your parents, kids are moving back home. There's all kinds of negative stuff. It's not the case that it's the booming economy of the 50s. You need to be worried as well. So there's this phrase, I don't know whether he coined it, egalitarian capitalism. And it's, what's this guy? Categorical, Douglas Massey, I think. Egalitarian capitalism, and it sounds peculiar because what is that? Is that like jumbo shrimp or business ethics? And the idea is, if in this book, Categorical Unequal, he traces out, if you look at the capitalism in the US, the 1930s up to the 1970s, it was much more equal than what we have now. Whereas now, as you know, we have this sort of massive transfer of wealth upwards to the top 1 or the top 0.1%. So his argument is that this has been accomplished through the rollback of progressive taxation, through the weakening of the trade union movement, through deregulation, through sort of neoliberalism and the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, and that this is what has led to the situation in the Western world of these extremes of wealth and poverty far more sort of radical than they were previously. So the left strategy for combining the quest for racial justice, an appeal to the group interest of whites, would basically try to bring together a program of corrective racial justice with a program of redistributive class justice to sort of form a union across racial lines. And in that way, the argument would be you could combine a moral appeal, an appeal to justice, with an appeal to people's self-interests, and that the hope is held out there for United States, which is basically not a United States for the few, but a United States where the economy is working for the vast majority. So it would be a non-white supremacist egalitarian capitalism for the first time in US history. Thank you.